Hey everyone, in this video I'm going to show you the full 3D process of creating this stylized magic portal using Blender and Substance Painter. It was a 10-hour project that I carefully condensed so you can follow along without missing any of the important steps. I used my own custom brushes throughout this project, but since I want you to be able to learn and follow the workflow easily, I've included a free demo pack with some of them that you can download and use. So whether you are here to improve your skills or just enjoy the process, I hope you find this useful. Let's start with the video. For the blockout, I actually started without a super clear idea in mind. I searched online for portal references and also looked back at a portal I made 4 years ago on this channel, so I ended up designing as I went. Of course, having a concept art from the beginning will be ideal, but working this way can also be a great exercise to improve your creative thinking and improvisation. I began by blocking out the portal with simple shapes, and I added a reference armature with a height of 1.75 meters to keep the scale consistent throughout the process. At this stage, it is important to start refining your base idea as much as possible, even though changes can still be made later on. Defining certain elements early will help a lot down the line. For example, instead of leaving the base steps as a single merged piece, I decided to separate them into individual parts. I also made sure to close all the faces on each piece, which is crucial if you plan to use the remesh modifier later. As you probably know, remesh won't work properly if the mesh isn't completely closed, so I ensured to close everything during the blockout process. From this point, I started thinking about how to create a tree trunk going through the portal. To do this, I used simple vertices and extruded them to shape the base. Then I added a skin modifier along with subdivision surface modifier. This workflow makes it really easy to model the trunk in a flexible, non-destructive way. And to scale specific points along the trunk, I used the shortcut Ctrl+A and simply dragged the cursor to adjust the thickness. After finishing the blockout of the tree, I decided to add some rocks around the base of the portal. For this, I used the bisect tool, which I assigned to a mouse shortcut for faster access. You can find the bisect tool in the mesh menu at the top left of the viewport. It is really handy for quickly cutting geometry and shaping rocks in a more controlled way. I also applied the same technique to the rocks surrounding the portal. At that point, I applied the mirror modifier since I needed to cut the rocks individually and break the symmetry a bit. That helped the scene feel more natural and less repetitive. As I usually do, I added the remesh modifier to one of the portal rocks, setting it to level 10. Once I was happy with it, I applied the modifier to other rocks. This gave me enough density to comfortably start sculpting the details without worrying about geometry issues. But it might be quite busy demanding, so adjust those levels according to your system. As always, I began sculpting the rocks, starting with a light pass using the scrape brush. You can use Blender's default brush or the free ore brushes pack, which I've linked in the video description. This helps break up the perfect cut we made during the blockout process, giving the rocks a more natural and regular feel. Next, I started adding new details, specifically levels, which are details I add using my custom brush pack. And remember, you can download both the full and the demo free versions from the description so you can follow along with this video. These steps help break up the irregularity of the faces on each rock, ensuring a more stylized and interesting result. Now I decided to add some runes to the rock sculptures using my latest rune pack. You can find the full version in the description, but I also made a free demo version you can download and use it if you want to follow along with this project without any issues. For every sculpt I make, I apply the decimate modifier, usually with a ratio between 0.2 and 0.4. This helps to reduce the triangle count up to 60%, making it easier to keep working in Blender without using too many resources. Keep in mind that applying this modifier can take a couple of minutes depending on how dense the mesh is. Also, once it is applied, you won't be able to sculpt on that mesh anymore, so it is really important to save multiple backups throughout the process. I did repeat the exact same process for the following rock pieces, which includes remesh, sculpting using the scrape brush, then adding levels with the brush, finishing the sculpt, and then applying decimate modifier. I decided to start sculpting the tree trunk. In this case, I applied remesh directly from sculpt mode using the remesh tool and set the voxel size to 0.44. This gave me a solid base to start adding detail. For sculpting the wood, I decided to keep it simple. Using just a sharp crease brush by holding Ctrl, I can add details along the entire trunk. It is a simple and most stylized method that I use when sculpting trees. Using the snake hook brush, I added some roots at the base of the tree, wrapping one of the rocks and giving the rest of the roots an interesting style. To make sure those roots or any added geometry become real mesh, we need to apply the remesh tool again. To optimize all the meshes, I start adding the decimate modifier. When it comes to rock, it is not as important to have perfect geometry with all the quads. We can simply use decimate and end up with a mesh full of triangles. Just keep in mind that this approach is suitable for static meshes that won't be deformed like rocks. For characters or models that will deform, we need to pay much more attention to the topology. I reduce the decimate modifier as much as possible without distorting the silhouette, reducing the triangle count up to 99%, making it low poly model suitable for using in a game. At the same time, I start adding seams, usually along edges with around 90 angles or similar. This way I can begin working on the UVs while optimizing the model. For some of the pieces, I do a simple retopology by placing a mesh on top of the sculpt model in a straightforward way. It is important to rename the topology mesh with the same name as the original object. For more details on this, I recommend checking out my video on baking from Blender to Substance Painter to learn everything in detail. For the tree, I did exactly the same process as with the rocks. I reduced it as much as possible to make it low poly. Now in Substance Painter, I bake the high poly model onto the optimized mesh and begin texturing using my base material. Remember, you can find it in the description, and if you want to learn how to create it from scratch, check out my latest video where I model a stylized rock. It is a good idea to add some filters after finishing the textures, such as contrast, sharpen, color balance, and color correct, because this helps us to normalize the overall look of the textures and make them feel more cohesive. Once I had the portal textures ready and back in Blender, I decided to create a bit of an environment around it. In this case, I started by designing a simple grass floor, first by modeling some shapes and then turning them into a brush. This gave me a grass base to begin with, and from that specific color I could start creating foliage that feels cohesive with the rest. I originally didn't plan to add an entry effect to the portal, but in the end I did it by simply painting something quickly with bluish tones and then distorting it using Photoshop distortion effects. I always try to pick a color sample from the textures underneath wherever I'm painting. In this case, I sampled from the tree trunk texture, so I could use very similar colors, and that way, even though they are different textures, they still feel related and cohesive. The whole process from this point on, it is relatable, simple. You just need a general idea of how to paint foliage. I'm not an expert in this area, but by looking at hand-painted foliage references on Pinterest, I was able to get the result you see here. So I just created it on the fly, following what I felt right. this is the final result. I honestly hope you learned from this video. I know the video speed might not be ideal for everyone, but summarizing 10 hours of work in such a short time is quite challenging. Still, remember, you can find longer videos on my channel where I go more in depth on various topics, so feel free to check those out. With that said, thank you so much for watching, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.